Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking to author and lawyer Ryan Manucha about his award-winning new book, Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups. Now, Ryan, we were talking about the notion of non-tariff barriers, how there can be an indirect restriction on trade, and there's a method that's been developed to try and pierce this veil of what is the actual purpose of a restriction on trade. A is it actually intended to be a restriction on trade, or is it for some other purpose? In the Como beer case, the government argued it was a public health was the primary purpose. So let's get into this notion of primary purpose. This is part of the test in determining if something is a trade barrier. Is the primary purpose to restrict trade, or is there some other valid purpose? Now, the Canadian courts, you say in your book, have adopted what appears to be a very rigid and one-dimensional test about primary purpose, even though there are some better examples of more flexible tests from, for example, other jurisdictions or even the World Trade Organization. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give some examples from your book about primary purpose for a trade barrier? And there was a great example of beef in Korea, beef being imported to Korea.
Yes, absolutely. So, primary purpose is a bit of what I argue to be not a very strong test to discern is this a real legitimate policy objective that we got going on here, or is it protection? In Korea, there was threat by Alberta beef essentially and foreign beef in general on the domestic Korean beef producers. And so what they did was they said, okay, if you have foreign beef, you actually have to literally sell it at either a separately designated part of your store, or like in certain cases in a separate physical store altogether. And but then the WTO came in and said, well, wait a second, if your concern is about consumer, because the argument was consumers are getting confused, people are cheap foreign beef is being masqueraded as higher quality Korean beef, and so for that reason we need to physically separate where you can purchase the two. And the WTO court said, well, there are way less intrusive ways to do this. Like if you're asking someone to go to a different store to pick up their beef, they're probably not going to go buy that beef. Why don't you just have a different labeling system? Why don't you just have a more enforced, packaging systems to comply to whatever? There are way less intrusive ways to do so. And that's kind of what Canada's judicial test does not have at the moment. And perhaps we'll see that in the coming years and decades, maybe the next time we have a Section 121 case, is this ability to give the judge what, in the WTO called the necessity test. And, yes, maybe this is a legitimate public purpose, protection of your salmon stock, protection of your beef, for consumers, protection of consumers from confusing beef. But is there a less invasive, less trade restrictive way to do the same thing?
But, Canadian jurisprudence really doesn't do that. And one of the downsides of it is it kind of takes government at their word about what the primary purpose is. There was one case called Great Western Brewing where the veil around the purpose was sort of pierced because the company, Great Western Brewing, challenging Alberta trade restriction, actually got access to internal government documents that revealed this primary purpose. We've got about a minute and a half left. What can you tell me about that case and whether this exceptional threshold of the government admitting in documents that it has this ulterior motive should really be the only way you can challenge a trade barrier?
Yeah, yeah. That was a fascinating situation where, yes, there were actual documents from internal government sources that allowed them to point to, literal text and say, hey, you literally said this was for the purpose of protection. Canadian claimants such as Great Western, they may not be so fortunate in the future. And I think it's a signal to other provincial governments, don't ever put that in writing that the purpose
or do put it in writing if your goal is to improve trade.
Yeah, yeah. So it's tough, and so the question is, can we give can maybe the Supreme Court give judges across the country judicial tools to be a bit more searching when they are confronted with another 121 case?
We've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about something I learned in your book. I know I love this topic, but I love learning more about it as much as I can. And one of the things I really found fascinating was your discussion about the Canadian Internal Trade Secretariat, a organization I think I didn't know much about. I think a lot of Canadians don't know it even exists. But we've got to go to break. When we come back, we're going to talk about that organization and some of the democratic challenges associated with it. We'll be right back.